The world seemed to stop when the first whispers emerged, whispers that quickly thundered into headlines that flashed across screens in every corner of the globe. He's no longer with us. For words, heavy with centuries of tradition and meaning, announced the death of King Charles. For most of us, we have known only the reign of Queen Elizabeth for nearly all our lives, and King Charles's reign was barely beginning to take shape, just long enough to mark a new chapter, yet short enough to make his passing feel like an abrupt punctuation to a story still unwritten. And in that silence that followed the announcement, one question hung thick in the air: what happens now? Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. As dawn broke over London, the city's heartbeat slowed to a muted rhythm. Black flags were lowered at Buckingham Palace, and the air seemed chilled, not by weather but by grief. The streets outside the gates filled with hushed crowds, strangers drawn together by the weight of history. Faces were pressed against iron railings, flowers clutched in trembling hands, candles flickering in the gray of the morning. Some whispered prayers, others simply stood in stunned silence, as if their very presence could carry the weight of this transition. And yet, amid the sorrow, a centuries-old protocol was already moving with astonishing speed. For in the very same breath that mourned the death of a king, the nation prepared to crown a new monarch. Prince William and Princess Catherine, a couple beloved and familiar to millions, suddenly found themselves thrust into a role they had only prepared for in shadows. Overnight, they were king and queen, their lives transformed in a heartbeat. The purpose of this story is not only to recount the passing of King Charles, but to walk through the shockwaves it sent rippling across the world. To explore the behind-the-scenes scramble in the palace, the ancient traditions that allow no pause for grief, the sudden pressure placed on William and Catherine, and the reactions from citizens and leaders alike. To understand why the monarchy, an institution so steeped in ceremony and history, demands such immediate action, and how the eyes of billions fell on two people who had not asked for the crown to come so quickly. It is a moment of sorrow and renewal, grief and hope, and it holds a significance far beyond a single family. Imagine for a moment the stillness of the night before the announcement, the calm before the storm. Charles in his final hours, perhaps surrounded by those closest to him, doctors nearby, advisors already quietly preparing for the inevitable. For years, the palace rehearsed Operation Menai Bridge, the code name for Charles's death, just as it had once rehearsed Operation London Bridge for Elizabeth. Every phone call, every announcement, every military salute had been drafted, revised, and perfected for this very day. Yet no matter the planning, nothing can fully prepare a nation for the moment its head of state is gone. The machinery of monarchy shifted instantly, unstoppable and precise. But in homes across Britain and beyond, ordinary people sat frozen, trying to process the fact that one reign had ended and another had begun without a single breath in between. The middle of this unfolding story belongs to the human heart of it. The grief etched on William's face as he walked out to address the nation for the first time as king. His voice, steady but weighted with emotion, carried not only the sorrow of losing a father, but the monumental burden of leadership suddenly resting on his shoulders. Catherine stood beside him, her presence quiet yet commanding, her own transformation visible in real time. She was no longer simply a princess, admired for her elegance and warmth. She was now Queen Catherine, her role permanently altered, her responsibilities magnified. For a couple that had carefully balanced family life with public duty, this was the moment everything changed. Their children, George, Charlotte, and Louis, were awakened to the reality that their family's destiny had shifted overnight. George, especially, now stood as heir to the throne, his childhood thrust into a sharper light. But beyond the walls of the palace, the reaction spread like fire across the globe. The Commonwealth, still tethered to the monarchy by history and politics, entered a period of deep reflection. Leaders issued statements, flags dipped, and national broadcasters interrupted regular programming to deliver tributes. In Australia, in Canada, in New Zealand, questions began resurfacing about the future of their ties to the crown. And in the United States, networks looped footage of William and Catherine stepping forward as the face of the new monarchy, casting them as the embodiment of renewal. Yet amid the global mourning, intrigue lingered. How would Harry and Meghan react? Would they return, reconcile, or remain distant, locked in the shadows of controversy? Even in grief, the royal family remained under a microscope, every move dissected, every silence filled with speculation. To fully appreciate the end of one reign and the dawn of another, we must consider the weight of tradition. The British monarchy is not just a symbol, it is a machine of continuity, a structure that survives precisely because it refuses to pause. At the exact moment King Charles drew his final breath, William became king. There is no gap, no vacuum, no uncertainty. The words, "The king is dead, long live the king," are not just ceremonial. They are the guarantee of stability. And yet, behind that seamless transition lies a storm of emotion. The family grieves as any family would, even as they are compelled to put on faces of composure before the world. It is a reminder that these figures, often larger than life in the public eye, are human beings bearing the weight of personal loss under the unblinking gaze of history. The end of the introduction must return us to the heart of the matter. This moment is not only about death, but about rebirth. King Charles's reign, though brief compared to his mother's, marked an important bridge between eras. He was a monarch who cared deeply about climate change, architecture, and the modernization of tradition. His sudden passing has left many of those efforts unfinished, his legacy incomplete. Yet in William and Catherine, the monarchy finds its future, a couple who have spent years building an image of accessibility and stability, of dignity paired with relatability. Their coronation, hastily arranged yet steeped in ancient rituals, symbolizes a monarchy still able to adapt, still capable of capturing the imagination of the public. And so, as we prepare to journey deeper into the story, we stand at the crossroads of grief and hope. The mourning of a nation blends with the anticipation of a new reign. Questions loom. What kind of king will William be? How will Catherine redefine the role of queen for a modern age? And how will this moment alter the delicate balance of power, tradition, and identity that defines the monarchy itself? He's no longer with us. But in his absence, the world has turned to William and Catherine, now crowned overnight, tasked with carrying a crown that feels heavier than ever before. This is the beginning of their reign, forged in loss, defined by duty, and destined to shape the history of Britain and beyond for generations to come. This introduction now sets the stage for the chapters that follow, where each layer of this story will be unfolded in detail. The last hours, the palace announcement, the nation's mourning, the coronation, the reactions, and the legacy. But for now, the silence of those first few moments after the announcement still echoes. A king is gone. A new era begins. The last hours of King Charles were shrouded in the kind of solemnity and quiet preparation that only a palace could muster. For weeks, whispers had circulated about his health, but the palace, as always, had maintained a wall of discretion. Those close to him knew he had been unwell, yet the depth of his decline was hidden from the public eye. Behind the gilded doors of Clarence House and Buckingham Palace, courtiers and medical staff worked quietly, preparing for the inevitable, even as they clung to the hope of a recovery. The world had just begun adjusting to the idea of Charles as king after the monumental reign of his mother, Queen Elizabeth II. And then, almost before it had properly started, his chapter was closing. In those final hours, his family gathered in silence, a mixture of grief, duty, and disbelief etched on their faces. Prince William, the eldest son, sat close by, carrying the invisible knowledge that at any moment he would not just be a son mourning his father, but a king expected to lead a grieving nation. Princess Catherine remained by William's side, her presence as steady and reassuring as it had always been, aware that her role too would transform overnight. Camilla, the queen consort, was torn between her personal grief and the harsh reality that once Charles was gone, her position within the monarchy would diminish into a confusing half-shadow. The air in the room was heavy with finality, punctuated only by the soft hum of medical machines and the occasional whispered prayer. Even in his weakness, Charles clung to the passions that had defined him. He had been a man who carried the weight of expectation since childhood, a boy who grew into a Prince of Wales destined to wait longer for the crown than any heir in history. His interests in climate change, architecture, organic farming, and interfaith dialogue were not mere hobbies, but causes he fought for relentlessly. In his final hours, those around him could sense that his legacy was already shifting into something fragile, something that history would now freeze in place. His reign would be measured not in decades, but in fleeting moments, and his son would bear the weight of completing what he had begun. The palace had long prepared for this very moment. Operation Menai Bridge, the code name for Charles's passing, was meticulously rehearsed. Every staff member knew their role. When the time came, phone lines would hum with pre-scripted calls, television broadcasters would interrupt programs, military personnel would don mourning uniforms, and official websites would switch to black banners. As Charles slipped into unconsciousness, the machinery of monarchy began to stir. Protocol demanded that grief would be a private luxury, while public duty surged forward with unstoppable momentum. The paradox was cruel. In the moment of deepest loss, the family had to surrender themselves to tradition. When Charles finally passed, the silence in the room was overwhelming. No one spoke, yet everyone knew that history had shifted in an instant. William was now king. Catherine was now queen. The monarchy had pivoted seamlessly, as it always had, from one sovereign to the next, but the enormity of the change lingered heavily in the air. Camilla wept quietly, William bowed his head, and Catherine placed her hand on his arm, a gesture that seemed both intimate and historic at once. Within minutes, phone calls began. Advisors moved swiftly down corridors, briefing officials, contacting the Archbishop of Canterbury, and preparing the nation for what would soon be announced to the world. Outside those palace walls, life carried on in ordinary rhythm. People commuted to work, children walked to school, shopkeepers opened their stores. None of them yet knew that their king had died in the night. But within hours, their phones would buzz, televisions would flicker, and the headlines would scream across the globe, "King Charles is dead." Those moments of ignorance, before the news was shared, felt like the fragile pause between two chapters of history. The old world had ended, and the new had not yet been revealed. In those early hours, the royal household scrambled to balance dignity with speed. Messages were drafted for social media, speeches prepared for broadcasters, and black-edged stationery pulled from drawers. Military officials confirmed ceremonial details, gun salutes, proclamations, and processions. All of it had been rehearsed for years, yet the reality still pressed upon them with suffocating urgency. Time was moving fast, but grief moved slow. William and Catherine barely had the chance to mourn before they were summoned into discussions that would define the coming days. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, Harry and Meghan received the news. Their response was private, hidden from cameras, but speculation swirled. Would Harry return to Britain immediately, bridging the divide of the last years? Or would the gulf between brothers deepen, overshadowing the coronation to come? In that moment, the family drama that had played out for the world seemed trivial against the raw reality of death, yet it lingered all the same. For William, the knowledge that his brother's reaction would shape public perception added another invisible weight to the crown he had not yet worn. The press, tipped off by insiders and awaiting official confirmation, was already preparing their tributes. Newsrooms buzzed, anchors rehearsed somber scripts, and archival footage of Charles as a boy, as a young prince, and as king was pulled into montage reels. Networks coordinated black clothing for presenters. In the age of instantaneous media, there was no time to wait. The king was gone, and the world had to be told. The timing of the announcement was choreographed down to the minute. The prime minister would be informed first, then key government officials, then the press, and finally the public. Every second mattered, for the monarchy demanded dignity and precision. Back at the palace, William stood by a window, looking out at the gardens as dawn crept across the horizon. His reflection in the glass showed not only a grieving son, but the outline of a sovereign. His thoughts must have raced. Memories of his father, the lessons learned, the conflicts endured, and the moments of quiet understanding they had shared. Yet, layered over those thoughts was the reality of duty. He knew that by the time the sun was high, the world would see him as king, and there was no escape, no hesitation, no space for delay. He was stepping into a destiny that had always loomed, but had never felt so real. The final hours of Charles's life were both intimate and historic, quiet and thunderous, ordinary in their humanity, yet extraordinary in their significance. The man who had waited a lifetime for the crown had worn it briefly, and now it passed to his son. The monarchy, ancient and unyielding, had endured another transition, as it had for centuries. And in that transition, the lives of William and Catherine were forever altered. The palace statement was always going to be one of the most carefully crafted announcements in modern history. In times of loss, words become more than mere communication. They become history themselves, etched into the memory of a nation and replayed for generations. When King Charles passed away, the weight of centuries fell upon the courtiers and press officials tasked with choosing the exact words, the precise tone, the rhythm of grief and continuity. For the monarchy, every syllable mattered. The world would measure the strength of the institution in the way it spoke at this pivotal moment. It began in silence. Behind the gates of Buckingham Palace, aides and senior courtiers gathered around oak tables, the room dimly lit and tense. Drafts had been rehearsed for years, altered and updated with every change in Charles's health, but now it was real. The final version of Operation Menai Bridge's public script was in the hands of trusted staff. It was written in language that had to balance dignity, compassion, and reassurance. "It is with deep sorrow." The words were inevitable, familiar even, yet no less shattering. They would signal to the world that Britain had lost its king, and that the crown had shifted seamlessly to William. The statement itself, though only a few sentences long, carried the impact of a thunderclap. It read with restrained sorrow, acknowledging Charles's passing and expressing gratitude for his service. But more importantly, it made clear that continuity had been preserved. William was now king, Catherine was now queen. The monarchy does not allow gaps or uncertainty. The statement was less an obituary and more a baton pass, a reminder that while individuals pass away, the institution endures. In those few words, the grief of a family and the permanence of a state coexisted uneasily. Outside the palace, the scene was surreal. Crowds had already begun to gather, drawn by rumors and whispers spilling across social media. Phones buzzed with unverified reports, and journalists hovered at the edges, waiting for confirmation. When the official statement was finally pinned to the black iron gates of Buckingham Palace, a tradition stretching back centuries, a hush fell over the crowd. People pressed forward, some with tears already streaming down their faces, others frozen in stunned silence. The black-bordered announcement glistened under the early morning light, the royal crest at its head a stark reminder of the weight of monarchy. Cameras flashed, reporters spoke in hushed voices, and the first tributes began piling at the gates. Flowers, handwritten notes, photographs, and candles. Broadcasting stations moved quickly. The BBC interrupted its scheduled programming, screens turning black before fading into the solemn face of the anchor, dressed in black as protocol dictated. With the nation holding its breath, the anchor read the words aloud. "It is with the deepest sorrow that Buckingham Palace announces the death of His Majesty King Charles III." Those words carried across television sets, radios, and live streams, reaching millions at once. For some, it was the first confirmation of what they had already suspected. For others, it was the crushing first realization. Either way, the collective gasp of a nation seemed to reverberate through the air. Politicians responded almost instantly. The Prime Minister, informed hours earlier, appeared outside Downing Street to deliver a somber statement of her own. Her words echoed the palaces, but they also spoke to the future under King William. "Our thoughts are with the royal family at this time of profound loss. The nation mourns with them. Yet, even in grief, we look to the future with hope and unity, under the reign of His Majesty King William V." The inclusion of William's regnal name was deliberate, planting the seed of continuity and reassuring the public that stability had not wavered. International responses flooded in almost immediately. Leaders across the Commonwealth and beyond issued their own statements, carefully worded to honor Charles's contributions while recognizing William as the new monarch. In Ottawa, in Canberra, in Wellington, flags were lowered to half-mast. In Washington, the president addressed the American people, acknowledging Britain's loss as a moment of global significance. In Paris, Berlin, and Tokyo, tributes rang out. And yet, embedded in each message was the recognition of William and Catherine as the new faces of the monarchy. Even in death, the British crown commanded attention and respect on a scale no other institution could match. For William and Catherine, the palace statement was more than a public notice. It was the official moment their lives changed forever. Though the title passed instantly at Charles's final breath, it was the announcement that cemented their new reality in the eyes of the world. In the hours before the statement was released, they were still William and Catherine, a grieving son and daughter-in-law. But the moment the world heard the words, they were king and queen. From then on, every step, every word, every gesture would be dissected through the lens of sovereignty. Within the palace walls, the release of the statement set off a chain reaction. Departments began issuing detailed instructions for mourning rituals. Gun salutes would be fired, church bells would toll, and books of condolence would open across the country. The royal standard at Buckingham Palace was lowered, replaced with the Union flag at half-mast, an image that carried enormous symbolic weight. For ordinary citizens, these visual cues reinforced the reality of what the statement had just declared. Their king was gone, but their monarchy endured. Yet, amid the ceremonial precision, grief was still raw. Camilla, now stripped of the title queen consort by the sheer force of history's tide, found herself in an uncomfortable limbo. Though she had been at Charles's side for decades, her role in the public imagination was uncertain now that William and Catherine had taken center stage. The palace statement, notably, made no mention of her. That silence spoke volumes. It underscored the fact that William and Catherine were now the future, and Camilla was already sliding into the past. The statement also marked the beginning of a narrative battle in the media. Some outlets chose to focus on Charles's legacy, his long wait as heir, his environmental advocacy, his complicated marriage to Diana, and his attempts to modernize the monarchy. Others pivoted quickly to William and Catherine, casting them as a younger, fresher face for a new era. Headlines shifted from grief to speculation. What kind of king would William be? How would Catherine handle her new role as queen? And where, in all of this, did Harry and Meghan fit? The palace statement had not addressed them, leaving room for endless commentary. For the people gathered outside Buckingham Palace, however, the statement was less about politics and more about loss. Many wept openly, recalling Charles as the boy who had walked behind his mother's coffin, as the Prince of Wales who waited for decades, and as the king who had tried, however briefly, to carve out his own path. Parents explained the moment to their children, reminding them they were witnessing history. Strangers comforted each other in the cold morning air. The black-bordered piece of paper pinned to the gates was small and simple, but it carried the full weight of centuries of tradition. The palace statement closed the chapter of Charles's reign and opened the first page of William's. It was both an ending and a beginning, a public obituary and a proclamation of continuity. Its brevity belied its importance. In those carefully chosen words, a nation's sorrow and a monarchy's survival were intertwined. The power of the statement was not in its detail, but in its timing, its symbolism, and its precision. The true significance of the statement became clear in the hours that followed. Tributes poured in, ceremonies began, and the machinery of monarchy moved forward with relentless rhythm. But history would remember that it started with a simple declaration pinned to palace gates and read aloud to millions. King Charles was gone, and the United Kingdom had a new king and queen. The palace statement was more than a notice of death. It was the anchor that steadied the ship in the storm. It reminded the world that though individuals pass, the crown endures. And in that endurance, the story of William and Catherine's reign had officially begun. A nation in mourning is never an abstract idea when a monarch dies. It is a living, breathing reality that unfolds in every street, every home, and every heart touched by the crown. The morning after the palace statement, Britain awoke to a silence that felt deeper than usual. Trains still ran, shops still opened, and children still went to school, yet a strange quiet wrapped itself around the country. It was the quiet of collective grief, the hush of millions processing the loss of their king. For many, it wasn't just about Charles, but about the inevitability of change, the closing of one chapter and the beginning of another. Grief, when tied to the monarchy, becomes not only personal but national. Outside Buckingham Palace, the scene had transformed into something that resembled both a shrine and a gathering place. Crowds swelled as the hours passed, the gates soon buried beneath a sea of flowers, teddy bears, photographs, and handwritten letters. Some tributes were simple, a single rose tied with a black ribbon, while others were deeply personal, filled with words like, "Thank you for your service," or "Rest peacefully, Your Majesty." Parents lifted their children onto their shoulders so they could glimpse the gates. Tourists who had arrived in London for ordinary sightseeing found themselves caught in history, clutching cameras with tears in their eyes. The hum of quiet conversation, broken by sniffles and the soft flicker of candle flames, created a sacred atmosphere. The sound of church bells began to roll across the city. From Westminster Abbey to St. Paul's, the tolls marked the passage of the monarch's soul and reminded everyone within earshot that Britain was officially in mourning. The bells rang slowly, each note carrying with it a sense of finality. In towns and villages far from London, local churches joined in. People paused in their daily routines to listen, some bowing their heads on bustling high streets, others stopping their cars by the roadside. Grief, like music, travels quickly, and the tolling bells became the soundtrack of the nation's sorrow. The government declared a period of national mourning. Flags flew at half-mast across government buildings, schools, and even football stadiums. Television programming shifted entirely, news channels playing archival footage of Charles as a young boy, then as Prince of Wales, then as king. Talk shows and comedies were cancelled, replaced by somber documentaries and live updates. The BBC, ITV, Sky News, all wore black in tone and presentation. Even advertisements were suspended for a time, the airwaves left to carry only the collective voice of grief. Ordinary citizens felt the moment in their own ways. In pubs across the country, conversations revolved around Charles's passing, with older generations recalling his early years and younger ones comparing this moment to the memory of Queen Elizabeth's death. In schools, teachers tried to explain the magnitude of the event to children, many of whom could not yet grasp what it meant for one king to die and another to take his place overnight. Some children wrote letters that were collected by schools and sent to the palace, their innocent handwriting filled with simple but poignant phrases. "We will miss you, King Charles. Thank you for looking after us." Or, "Be with your mummy in heaven." Yet grief is never uniform. While millions mourned, some expressed indifference or even critique. Charles's reign had been marked by both devotion and controversy, and his passing resurfaced debates about the monarchy itself. In Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, the reactions were layered with political undertones. For some, the moment was deeply moving, a reminder of unity under the crown. For others, it was an opportunity to question the relevance of monarchy in a modern democracy. Outside the UK, the Commonwealth nations reflected similar divisions. In Jamaica and Barbados, leaders offered condolences, but their citizens debated more openly whether this transition should mark the end of their ties to the crown. Mourning, though widespread, carried with it the seeds of change. The military's role in the mourning was as visible as it was symbolic. Gun salutes echoed across Hyde Park, Edinburgh Castle, and Cardiff. Soldiers in crisp uniforms stood in perfect formation, their silence and precision embodying the gravity of the occasion. The sound of cannons reverberating across the land reminded citizens of the continuity of tradition. The military, like the monarchy, exists to anchor the nation in times of upheaval. As the salutes boomed, the faces of veterans in the crowd grew wet with tears, each explosion marking not just the loss of a king, but the passage of time. At Buckingham Palace, William and Catherine emerged to greet the crowds. It was one of the most anticipated moments of the mourning period, the first public appearance of the new king and queen. Their faces bore the marks of grief, yet they carried themselves with dignity. William shook hands, accepted flowers, and exchanged brief words with mourners. Catherine, dressed in black, accepted bouquets and comforted children who had come with their parents. Their presence was met with both tears and applause, the crowd torn between mourning Charles and celebrating the future. For many, the sight of William and Catherine together symbolized reassurance. They represented not only continuity but also renewal, a monarchy stepping forward even as it bowed its head in sorrow. The nation's mourning extended into private homes, where families gathered in living rooms, television screens glowing as broadcasters replayed the palace statement and shared tributes. Social media flooded with black and white photographs of Charles, quotes from his speeches, and messages of remembrance. Hashtags like #KingCharles and #LongLiveTheKing trended globally. Some users shared personal anecdotes of moments they had met him or seen him at public events. Others simply expressed solidarity with the royal family, turning their grief into collective empathy. Internationally, landmarks lit up in tribute. The Eiffel Tower dimmed its lights. The Sydney Opera House projected the Union Jack across its sails. New York's Empire State Building glowed in royal purple. Each gesture reinforced that this was not only Britain's loss, but the world's. Yet these gestures also highlighted the global fascination with the monarchy, a fascination that blends admiration, curiosity, and sometimes criticism. Still, on this day, the criticism was muted, replaced by respect for the moment. What made this mourning unique was the suddenness of the transition. With Elizabeth, the nation had grieved for a monarch who had reigned for 70 years. With Charles, the grief was mixed with shock, the realization that his reign had ended before it had fully begun. It was as if the nation had lost not only a king but the sense of stability that had just started to form after Elizabeth's passing. That uncertainty deepened the mourning, giving it an edge of disbelief. Yet through it all, the monarchy leaned on ritual. Mourning was not left to chance. It was structured, deliberate, and deeply symbolic. Every flag lowered, every bell tolled, every salute fired was designed to channel grief into a collective experience. In this way, the nation's mourning became not only an expression of sorrow but a reaffirmation of identity. By mourning together, Britain was reminded of what it shared, even amid divisions and doubts. As night fell, candles glowed in windows across cities and villages, their soft light echoing the vigil at the palace gates. Citizens lit them as symbols of remembrance, a simple act connecting millions in silent solidarity. The day ended as it had begun, in quiet, but with a deeper awareness that history had shifted. Charles was gone, but the nation's mourning had also marked the birth of a new reign. The mourning of a nation is never just about one man. It is about what he represented, what he left behind, and what comes next. In the days that followed, the grief of Britain would evolve into the pageantry of coronation, but in those first hours and days, mourning was the language of unity. The nation bowed its head together, and in that act, it prepared itself to lift its eyes toward the new king and queen. Prince William's first words as king were not just a speech. They were a moment carved into history, a delicate balancing act between the rawness of grief and the unshakable expectations of duty. The announcement of Charles's passing had barely settled, the nation still heavy with mourning, when the time came for William to step forward as sovereign. The cameras, the microphones, the global audience, all were waiting for him. He knew that the world's eyes would judge not only what he said but how he said it, the tone of his voice, the expression on his face, the way he carried the unbearable weight of being both a grieving son and the new king. The preparations for this address began almost immediately after Charles's death was confirmed. Advisors gathered around polished tables at Buckingham Palace. Scripts were drafted, revised, and whispered about in hushed corridors. William, however, insisted on shaping the words himself. He understood that authenticity mattered. A king cannot speak in phrases that sound written by committee. His words must resonate with sincerity, even if crafted with help. As he sat in a private study, pen in hand, he wrestled with the task: how to honor his father, acknowledge the pain of a nation, and still project the stability and continuity expected of a monarch. It was not only a speech, it was his first act as king. When the time came, the nation waited in silence. Families gathered around televisions, pubs dimmed their lights, classrooms paused their lessons. The BBC's coverage showed the newly crowned William stepping into the frame, dressed in a black suit, his face solemn yet composed. Behind him, a simple backdrop, no grandeur, no distraction. The simplicity was deliberate. It was the words, not the stage, that mattered. His voice, the though steadied by resolve, carried the unmistakable undertone of grief. He began by addressing the loss. My father, His Majesty King Charles, devoted his life to this nation, to the Commonwealth, and to the causes he believed in so deeply. Today, we mourn not only a king, but a man of conviction, a father, and a grandfather whose love and guidance shaped my life. The words rippled through living rooms and radios. He was not just honoring a monarch, but speaking as a son, making the grief relatable to millions who had also lost parents, who understood the duality of sorrow and responsibility. Then came the pivot, the moment where William shifted from grief to continuity. At this moment of profound sorrow, I take upon myself the responsibilities passed to me. The crown, as it has for centuries, endures. I pledge to serve you with loyalty, with integrity, and with the same devotion my father and grandmother before him gave to this nation. It was a line that would be replayed for years, a solemn oath that linked him to the past while pointing toward the future. The speech was not lengthy, but every phrase was crafted with purpose. He spoke of Catherine, referring to her as his queen for the first time in public, calling her his partner in duty and life. He acknowledged his children, George, Charlotte, and Louis, noting that they too understood the significance of this moment. In doing so, he framed his reign not as an individual journey, but as a family stepping into history. It was a subtle yet powerful gesture, one that humanized him while projecting stability. As William spoke, Catherine sat just beyond the frame, watching closely. Her presence was not needed on camera, but those who saw her afterward described her quiet strength, her hand resting on William's shoulder as he returned from the broadcast. She knew better than anyone that this was the first of countless moments where her husband would stand before the world, carrying a burden far heavier than most could imagine. The public's reaction to William's words was immediate. On social media, clips of the address spread like wildfire, accompanied by messages of support, admiration, and relief. Many commented on his composure, praising him for speaking with honesty and dignity. Some compared his tone to that of his grandmother, Elizabeth, whose speeches had always balanced simplicity with depth. Others saw echoes of Diana in his sincerity, the way he spoke from the heart rather than cloaked in formality. The overwhelming sentiment was one of reassurance. The monarchy was in steady hands. Yet not everyone responded with unqualified praise. Critics pointed out that William avoided mention of controversial issues, his father's divisive years as Prince of Wales, the ongoing estrangement with Harry, or questions about the monarchy's relevance in modern society. For some, the omissions were a reminder that monarchy often shields itself behind carefully curated language. But for the majority, those criticisms felt secondary in a moment so charged with emotion. What mattered was that William had stepped forward and spoken not as a distant sovereign, but as a man grieving alongside his people. Internationally, the speech was broadcast with translations and subtitles. In America, networks like CNN and NBC carried it live, framing William and Catherine as symbols of modern royalty. In Europe, the tone was more analytical, with commentators debating what his reign might mean for Britain's relationship with the continent. In the Commonwealth, leaders quoted portions of the speech in their own addresses, seeing in his words a signal of continuity. The message had traveled farther than any one broadcast. It had reached the collective consciousness of the world. Behind the scenes, the speech also carried immense personal weight. William knew that once he had spoken as king, there was no turning back. His private grief was now permanently fused with public duty. He would have to find his moments of mourning in rare silences, away from cameras, away from the eyes of a nation that looked to him for strength. The speech was his first taste of this reality, the first reminder that as king, his life was no longer entirely his own. The address also marked a generational shift. William's words, though steeped in tradition, carried a more conversational tone than those of his father or grandmother. He used phrases that felt accessible, relatable, designed to resonate not just with older generations, but with younger citizens who often felt disconnected from the monarchy. His reference to Catherine as my partner in duty spoke to a modern understanding of marriage and leadership. His acknowledgement of his children reminded people that this was not just about history, it was about the future. In the days that followed, the speech was dissected, analyzed, and praised. Newspapers printed full transcripts, headlines calling it a steady hand in troubled times and the voice of a new era. Royal commentators noted the deliberate choices in phrasing, the subtle nods to continuity, and the careful avoidance of political entanglements. For ordinary citizens, however, the meaning was simpler. Their new king had spoken to them directly, and he had done so with sincerity. But perhaps the most important effect of William's first words was the way they gave people permission to look forward. Mourning was still fresh, grief still heavy, but his speech opened a door to hope. It reminded the nation that while they had lost a king, they had gained a monarch who carried not only the legacy of his father, but the promise of a new era. It was not a speech designed to heal all wounds or answer all questions. It was a speech meant to steady the ship, to give the nation something to hold on to in a sea of uncertainty. As William left the broadcast room, he reportedly paused for a moment, alone, before returning to Catherine and his advisors. In that pause, he must have felt the shift within himself. No longer simply William, the son, the husband, the father. He was William the King. His first words had set the tone for his reign. From this point on, every word he spoke would carry the weight of a crown. Princess Catherine's transformation into queen was not merely the conferring of a title. It was a profound moment in which her public image, her responsibilities, and even her relationship with the world shifted overnight. For years, she had been admired as the Duchess of Cambridge and then as Princess of Wales, balancing the delicate expectations of royal life with the authenticity and warmth that endeared her to millions. But with the death of King Charles, Catherine crossed an invisible threshold. She was no longer simply the supportive wife of the heir. She was Queen Catherine, consort to a reigning king, her every action now woven into the very fabric of the monarchy. The morning after Charles's passing, newspapers across the world carried two images side by side. William, solemn and steady, stepping into his role as king, and Catherine, dressed in mourning black, embodying grace under unimaginable pressure. For many, the juxtaposition symbolized not only continuity, but also the sense of renewal that William and Catherine together represented. She had long been seen as a stabilizing force in William's life, a figure of calm composure who modernized the monarchy simply by being herself. Now, she was thrust into history, no longer simply a royal figure, but a queen. The palace had prepared for this transition in theory, but the reality was staggering. Catherine's role as queen was not just ceremonial. She became a symbol of unity, a maternal figure for the nation, and a partner in the execution of the monarchy's duties. Her responsibilities expanded overnight. State banquets, audiences with world leaders, patronages elevated to global platforms, and the expectation to embody both dignity and relatability at all times. For Catherine, who had spent over a decade carefully shaping her public image, the weight of the crown was both a natural progression and a daunting escalation. In the immediate aftermath of Charles's death, Catherine's composure was widely remarked upon. At her first public appearance as queen, she walked among mourners outside Buckingham Palace, her hand lightly brushing the arms of children who handed her flowers, her words soft but strong as she thanked people for their condolences. Photographs captured her smiling gently through tears, offering comfort to strangers even as she bore her own grief. In that moment, she was not only mourning a father-in-law, but stepping into a role that demanded she be more than herself. She had to be an anchor for the nation. What made Catherine's ascension so compelling was her relatability. Unlike many who married into the monarchy, she was not born into aristocracy. She was a commoner, raised in a middle-class family, who fell in love with a prince at university. Her journey from student to queen resonated deeply with the public, who saw in her a reflection of themselves. The idea that someone so seemingly ordinary could now wear the crown gave her reign an accessible quality. It was as if the monarchy itself had become more human, more approachable, simply because Catherine was part of it. Yet behind the grace and the smiles lay immense pressure. As queen, she would be expected to walk a tightrope between tradition and modernization. Every gesture, every outfit, every word would be dissected by media, praised by some, critiqued by others. Already, commentators speculated about how she would differ from Camilla or even Elizabeth. Would she bring a softer, maternal touch to the role, or would she step into a more assertive form of leadership alongside William? Would she reshape the monarchy's image for younger generations? These questions hung in the air even as she knelt to accept flowers from a grieving child. Catherine's relationship with the public had always been one of quiet trust. She did not seek the spotlight in the way some others had, but when she appeared, she commanded attention through authenticity. As queen, that trust became even more vital. Her patronages, mental health, early childhood development, and support for families were suddenly amplified, no longer just projects of a princess, but causes championed by a queen. Her voice carried more weight, her influence stretched further, and her ability to humanize the monarchy became one of its greatest assets. For her children, Catherine's new role was a seismic shift as well. Prince George, suddenly the heir to the throne, would grow up in a world more scrutinizing than ever. Princess Charlotte and Prince Louis, too, would feel the ripple effects of their mother's transformation. Catherine's role as queen demanded more time in the public eye, more ceremonial obligations, and more international travel. Yet, as she had always done, she sought balance, determined to keep her family grounded even while wearing a crown. Her ability to merge motherhood with monarchy was now part of her legacy in the making. The international press played a significant role in shaping Catherine's image as queen. In America, she was hailed as a modern Diana, elegant, compassionate, and charismatic. In Europe, she was praised for her diplomacy, already viewed as a bridge between the monarchy and world leaders. In the Commonwealth, her ascension was seen with mixed emotions, admiration for her character, but also skepticism about whether the monarchy itself should continue to play a role in their nations. Still, her presence softened debates, her popularity making conversations about republicanism more complicated than straightforward. But perhaps the most powerful moment of her early days as queen came during a private audience with staff at the palace. Witnesses described how Catherine, though weary with grief, spoke directly to the gathered staff, thanking them for their loyalty and dedication. She reminded them that though the monarchy was in transition, their work was vital in carrying it forward. It was not a grand speech for the cameras, but a quiet reassurance to those who held the institution together. That small act reflected the essence of her reign, leading not only through ceremony, but through empathy. The symbolism of Queen Catherine cannot be overstated. In her, the monarchy embodies the values of modern Britain: resilience, family, and service. She represents continuity with the past through her marriage to William, but also change. As someone who did not grow up within palace walls, yet now finds herself at the heart of them. Her reign as queen alongside William promises to redefine how the monarchy connects with its people, making it less distant, more human, and yet no less majestic. The crown, heavy with centuries of tradition, now rests on her head, but Catherine wears it with an ease that reassures the nation. In her, people see not only a queen but a woman who has walked beside her husband for decades, who has raised her children with love, who has carried herself with dignity through trials and triumphs alike. The world will watch as she grows into the role, but in those first days, it was clear that Queen Catherine was more than ready. The transformation of Catherine into queen marked one of the most profound shifts in modern royal history. It was not just about titles or ceremonies. It was about the embodiment of a monarchy that is learning to adapt while holding fast to its traditions. Her role is no longer in the shadows. She is at the very center of history. And as she stood beside William in those first public moments, mourning yet radiant with strength, the people knew that their monarchy, though changed, was safe in her hands. Behind closed doors, the royal family's reaction to King Charles's passing was far more complex than the polished image projected to the public. The palace has always been a master of ceremony, knowing how to choreograph grief for the cameras. Yet, away from the lenses and rehearsed statements, the family's emotions were raw, conflicting, and deeply human. This was not just the end of a king. It was the loss of a father, a husband, a grandfather, and for some, a figure of tension whose absence carried both sorrow and unresolved wounds. In the hours following his death, the atmosphere inside Buckingham Palace was heavy with both grief and duty. Courtiers moved swiftly, whispering about arrangements, rehearsing protocols, and preparing announcements, but in the private apartments, the family sat in stunned silence. Prince William had already stepped into the role of king by necessity, but he was also a son mourning a father he had admired and struggled with in equal measure. His eyes, red with sleeplessness, betrayed the weight of dual burdens, a crown on his head and grief in his heart. He was said to have sat in silence for long stretches, Catherine beside him, occasionally placing her hand on his arm to remind him that he was not alone. For Catherine, grief came with an additional responsibility. She had been close to Charles, who had welcomed her into the family with warmth and respect. His passing was a personal loss, but as queen she now had to maintain composure, serving as the steady anchor for both William and the children. Her role in these private hours was not only as a mourner, but as the glue that held her family together while the machinery of monarchy roared to life around them. She comforted George, Charlotte, and Louis, explaining to them gently what had happened, helping them understand that their grandfather was gone and their father was now king. Prince Harry's reaction was shrouded in more tension. Living in California, he received the news not in the presence of his family but across an ocean, separated by both geography and years of strained relationships. Reports later suggested that Harry felt conflicted, devastated by the loss of his father, yet uncertain how he would be received if he returned to Britain. The rift between him and William, already wide, seemed insurmountable in the rawness of grief. Meghan comforted him, but the weight of history pressed down on them both. Would Harry return to stand alongside his brother in mourning, or would he remain distant, further estranging himself from the monarchy he had stepped away from? In those early hours, the silence between the brothers was telling, a gulf of unspoken words and unresolved pain. Queen Camilla's grief was perhaps the most complicated. She had stood beside Charles for decades, enduring public criticism, gradual acceptance, and finally recognition as queen consort. His passing stripped her of that role instantly, casting her into a shadowed space that history has reserved for widowed consorts. Within the family, her sorrow was genuine. She had lost the man she loved and had built a life with. Yet in the palace hierarchy, her place was suddenly uncertain. William and Catherine were now the faces of the monarchy, and Camilla's influence was diminished overnight. For her, grief was entangled with a quiet fear of fading into irrelevance. Princess Anne, Charles's sister, responded with the stoicism that has long defined her. Known for her practicality and sense of duty, she was one of the first to dive into arrangements, ensuring that protocols were followed and family members supported. Yet those who knew her best said she was deeply shaken, and had been Charles's confidant, his ally in navigating the labyrinth of royal responsibility. His passing left her feeling as though she had lost not just a brother, but her closest partner in duty. Still, she pushed her emotions aside, understanding that history would not wait for her tears. Prince Edward and Sophie, too, played quiet roles in those hours. Edward, often overshadowed by his siblings, carried the sorrow of losing his older brother but remained focused on supporting the family structure. Sophie, who had grown especially close to both Charles and the Queen, comforted Catherine and helped care for the children. Together, they embodied the less visible but no less important network of support within the family. The grandchildren's reactions revealed the human side of monarchy. George, now the direct heir, reportedly struggled to comprehend the gravity of the moment. He understood, in theory, that his father was now king, but the enormity of it weighed heavily on his young shoulders. Charlotte, empathetic and intuitive, was said to have asked questions about what it meant for their family and whether they would still see Grandpa Wales, as she had affectionately called Charles. Louis, too young to fully grasp the situation, was shielded from the heaviest aspects of mourning, but his innocent questions, "Why can't we see him again?" pierced the hearts of those around him. Catherine bore the brunt of these conversations, her calm explanations helping her children, while she herself carried unspoken grief. Behind closed doors, conversations turned to what came next. Advisors briefed William on the immediate duties, the speech to the nation, meetings with government officials, the logistics of Charles's funeral, and the planning of the coronation. The weight of this transition pressed heavily on him, but his family's presence reminded him of why he must endure it. Catherine's voice in those moments was steady, encouraging him to see beyond the immediate chaos to the long-term vision of their reign. There were also private tensions. Harry's name came up in discussions. Should he be invited to the funeral in a prominent role, or would his presence cause distraction? Some feared that the optics of excluding him would deepen public perception of division. Others argued that including him too prominently would overshadow the solemnity of Charles's legacy. William's silence on the matter was telling. His relationship with Harry was too fractured to make the decision without difficulty. Catherine, pragmatic as ever, urged for compassion, knowing the public would expect some gesture of unity. The family's private mourning was also marked by memory. Stories of Charles circulated among them, his quirks, his passions, his humor. They recalled how he had insisted on talking about organic farming at family dinners, or how he would stop to admire architecture during walks, delaying everyone with his enthusiasm. These small memories brought both tears and laughter, humanizing the king who had so often seemed distant in public. It was in these stories that the family found solace, a reminder that Charles was not only a monarch but a father, a brother, a husband, and a grandfather whose absence left a profound void. The atmosphere within the palace was a strange blend of grief and ritual. Courtiers moved briskly, papers shuffled, telephones rang, while in private rooms the family tried to process their loss. The duality of monarchy was never more evident. Personal sorrow alongside public duty, tears wiped away before stepping out to face the cameras. Catherine, William, and the children leaned on each other, while the older generation, including and Edward, steadied the ship of tradition. In those private hours, the royal family revealed itself as both deeply human and deeply bound by history. Their reactions, though hidden from the public, carried the complexity of love, duty, resentment, and loyalty that defines every family, magnified 1,000 times by the weight of the crown. The world would see their polished faces, their dignified appearances, their carefully spoken words. But behind closed doors, they were simply a family in mourning, grappling with the loss of the man who had been both their king and their own. The coronation of Prince William and Princess Catherine, conducted almost overnight, was unlike anything Britain had seen in centuries. Coronations are typically the result of months, even years, of preparation, meticulously choreographed ceremonies layered with symbolism, pageantry, and precision. But in the wake of King Charles's sudden passing, the machinery of monarchy was forced into extraordinary motion. The nation needed assurance that its crown was secure, that continuity had not faltered. The phrase long embedded in royal tradition, "The king is dead, long live the king," was no longer a ceremonial utterance, but a living reality. For William and Catherine, grief was set aside, repla.